Yesterday I attended the Republican Jewish Coalition's presidential forum, where Newt Gingrich, the current Republican frontrunner, pledged strong support for Israel. His remarks were widely covered in today's New York Times. Whenever his name is mentioned, including in this particular article, the media adds that given his penchant for going off script, it is not clear that he has the discipline to be president. That comment has become a corollary to any statement of his front-runner status. I don't say this to offer political commentary. I say this, however, to make a point. If you are slightly out of the box, if you push the envelope, if you come up with ideas that others can dismiss as flighty or inconsistent, you're not presidential material, because everything in our culture, everything in our society is designed not to invigorate us, but to subdue us. If you want to get a job, you got to fit into the culture. You got to put on a suit and a tie and impress the man or the woman in HR who's conducting the interview. If you want to get married, there's a certain way you need to look as well. That's why, for women today, there are only two great sins. Unfortunately, they are sins against the two most natural human processes, which is the sin of eating and the sin of aging. A woman can do anything else, and it's fine. But if you dare age or eat, you will pay a price, because your attractiveness will have been diminished, because there's a certain box into which you're supposed to fit. If you go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the box was more voluptuous, it was more curvaceous, and today it's more linear. Men must also fit into their box. They are not attractive to women through their being. They are attractive to women through their doing. So if a man is successful in what he does, and if the response to the first question women put to men in courtship, what do you do, is hedge fund manager, or I happen to own my own private diamond mine, well, you know, you have fit into the correct box and you instantly become attractive. And women are prepared to trade their commodity of beauty for your commodity of professional success. But it's not just dating and commerce and politics that seeks to always subdue us and have us fit into established categories. The sector most guilty of that is religion. Religion is that which subdues us more than anything else. To be a religious person is to submit your will to God's will. You want to drive on Shabbos? Tough. You want to make love to your spouse? It's not the right time. It's not the right time of the month. The very act of wearing a yarmulke is an act of submission. Yora Malka, he who fears the king. That's why so often religious people are so utterly colorless. They have had the personality beaten right out of them. As if they were designed to be the homo religiosus, the man of faith, is designed to be a black and white clad, ritual observing automaton who cannot think for himself. In fact, isn't that what superstition is? What percentage of our religious lives is superstition? 80%? If you give tzedakah, you're going to get rich. And if you go against God's will, someone might get sick. You might founder financially. That's just submission to the irrational. None of this makes sense. You mean God would let children die if parents were to sin in a certain way? Is there anything rational about this? But again, if the purpose of religion is to subdue the mind and subdue the heart, you're not supposed to think. Superstition doesn't involve any kind of thought. Virtually everything we're exposed to through the day robs us of our color, our vitality, and our personality. Why do you think we end up living this life that we consider stimulating annually? There's nothing particularly stimulating about it. Living in a suburb where we get to talk about whether the $25-odd million Ahavas Torah spent was well spent, not well spent, how could it have done better, the rooms could have been bigger, the rooms could have been brighter, the ceiling could have been higher. This is the subject of our conversation. Not that the rest of America is having any better conversations. They're talking about whether Kim Kardashian's wedding was actually real or staged. And so we go through our lives in a dreamlike state, believing we're living when really we're just existing. When he was a boy, he came out second, and he was holding on to his brother's heel. So they called him Yaakov. What? The holder of the heel. That's what most of us are. We deserve that name. We are the heel. We take orders. We follow orders. Society says you have to look a certain way. We will do everything to look that way. We will get on the damn treadmill and we will run and jump and pull and whatever it takes. Because society told us we have to look this way, and we will. And if it means that we have to succeed and earn money in order to matter, in order to even get an aliyah, in order to have our name on a wall and get some sort of communal recognition, we'll do that too. Even if it means neglecting our marriages, neglecting our children. We are the heel. And his name was Yaakov. He followed orders. And many people see in this great virtue. My gosh, the very word Islam means to submit. To be a Muslim is to be he who submits. There is the will of God, and your job is to prostrate yourself. Not halfway, all the way, 5 times a day. It's not to question. It's not to explore. It's to embrace and it's to accept. Unconditionally. Unequivocally. When confronted with the question of how God could command Abraham to slaughter his own child, the same God who said to him, through Isaac you will have offspring, the same God who would later declare that all human sacrifice would be an abomination, how could God inflict this sadistic, vicious commandment on Abraham, the great Danish Christian theologian Soren Kierkegaard invents and coins a new religious phrase, which is embraced till today. He said, you must make a leap of faith. There's nothing rational about this. You'll never understand the Akedah. But the greatness of Abraham is he made the leap of faith. He submitted. His name, too, ultimately became Yaakov. And from this belief that religion is about submission, many things have emerged. Nearly all of them toxic. 6 million Jews walked into gas chambers. And when those that didn't, and somehow survived, asked how? Why? Where was God? The answer was to submit. What do you mean, where was God? You are sinful. German Jewry wanted to assimilate. German Jewry were marrying out at a rate of 1 in 2. And they got what they deserved. And it's painful and it's tragic. But if we do teshuvah, then A second Holocaust will not be visited upon us. But it's human sin that brings in its wake God's justice and God's vengeance. Terrible things have followed in the wake of this belief that religion is supposed to be about submission, that we're never allowed to challenge, that we're always the guilty party. Friedrich Nietzsche, the great German philosopher, he came up with this incredible theory of the Übermensch, Superman. Who is Superman? Who's the Übermensch? The Übermensch is the guy that is released from the shackles of religion. And Hitler took this forward and said, if we get rid of Judeo-Christianity, which is all about submission, we will release humankind's natural proclivities to be powerful, will dominate the weak. Because all religion is it shackles you. Instead of taking revenge, it tells you to forgive. It took the great German Teutonic knights of old and it stripped them of their power. And I'm going to unleash it through things like the SS. And then God took this man whose name was Jacob, and in this week's Torah reading, after wrestling with an angel, he changes it. And what's his name? What does it become? Jacob is afraid of his brother. He too is ready to submit. He's going to give him presents. He's going to do whatever it takes to appease him. He ran from him 2 decades earlier. But God now sees that there's an opportunity to create a new man of faith. And what is the name he's given? Because we have that name till today. What's the name? He gives him the name Israel. What a change. You're no longer the heel. You're not here to be weak. Yisrael, he who wrestles with God and man. The defiant man of faith. The rebellious man of faith. Who's ever heard of a rebellious man of faith? Faith is about submission. The man who wrestles with God, you mean you don't just submit before God? From Yisrael was born a whole new nation. A nation of people who never again would accept the status quo. A nation that would forever be defiant. God comes to Avram and he says, the people of Sodom are roim v'chatoim l'Shem ha'od. They are exceedingly wicked. They deserve to die. And Avraham lifts his arm as a cudgel against the heavens, and he says something that is so chutzpahdik that it's amazing that its words remain recorded in the Torah until today. Hashofet kol ha'aretz lo ya'aseh mishpat. You who are the judge of the entire earth shall not yourself practice justice? He is accusing God of being unfaithful, of trampling on justice and righteousness. What kind of man would do that? Could any of you look God in the face and say, you mean you're a murderer? These are words that boggle the mind. But it was just the beginning. Later, when God sends Moshe to rescue the Jews from Egypt, and Moshe goes reluctantly, and he confronts Pharaoh and he says, let my people go. And Pharaoh says, let your people go. Not only will I not, I'm going to teach you a lesson, you chutzpah. I will take away all the people's straw. Moshe comes back to God. He doesn't have his head bowed in submission. He's not just going to be an Orthodox Jew and God is always right. And he is always some puny little mortal who doesn't understand cosmic whys and wherefores, sees himself as cosmic chaff. Instead, he says to God at the end of Parsha Shemos, Hatzel lo hitzalta esamecha. What kind of Savior and Redeemer are you? You have done nothing to save your people. He says to God, you've even made it worse. Since you have sent me, you've made it worse. A man who speaks that way to God, but it reaches its culmination when God wants to destroy the Jews after the sin of the golden calf. Moshe's on a mountain and he's getting the 10 Commandments. God suddenly says to him, Lech rei, get off. Yishiches amocha asher tzesameh Mitzrayim, for the people that you brought out of Egypt. They have sinned, saru mahar min haderech, they have left the righteous path. Asu lehem egel masecha, and they've made this molten image. Biyato hanichali, now you must let me be. and I will devour them, and I will make you into a greater nation than they. Moshe will now be George Washington, not just the prophet, but the father of a nation. Romulus and Remus, Garibaldi. And then in the greatest defense of human life ever recorded, Moshe begins a defense that is so eloquent that we read it every single Jewish fast day. Vayachal Moshe Pnei Hashem Elokav. And Moshe began to entreat the Lord, his God. Lama Hashem Yechera Abcha Bemecha. Why, O God, will you allow the people to suffer? And then he lays down the cudgel. He gives God an ultimatum and he says, Biata, and if you forgive them, then we will have a relationship. But if not, Mecheni no misifracha asher kasavta. Erase my name from the Torah you have written. I want to sever our relationship completely. There will be nothing left. Take my name out of your Torah. My friends, whatever happened to the rebellious man of faith? To the defiant man of faith? I have heard speeches all over this city from Rabbanim who can say almost every week that when something terrible happens, we are the ones who have to do teshuvah. Why Kletsky was dismembered and cut up into pieces. And Rabbanim in Borough Park said that it's because of the way women dress in the streets. God watched as a small child got lost, who couldn't find his way home. And I have this image in my mind, and it's haunting, of all those surveillance cameras, of this little boy coming to the corners, and he says to each person, where is my home? He's asking them directions. And all it took was for him to bump into one person who would have sent him to the right street. He was 2 blocks away. And God controls the whole universe. And He brings about the seasons. And He causes the earth to spin on its axis. And He makes sure that the cycle of the moon operates perfectly every 28 days. And the cycle of the sun every 365 days. But He couldn't make that kid bump into one person who would tell him where to go. And in fact, the only one He ends up asking out of a community of what, 20 or 30,000? Was the one psychopath who would end up cutting off his feet and putting him in a freezer? Whatever happens to the defiant man of faith that demands better of God? Do you know that after the Second World War, when 160 nations incinerated each other in the greatest conflagration in world history, they went to San Francisco in 1944, and they started the United Nations under Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And it's kind of startling. After all you saw was murder and mayhem, and there was the First World War, and this is just not even a generation later, a Second World War, and so many people, 12 million non-combatants dead, 100 million people dead, and the likes of Mussolini and Hitler. What made them think they could bring peace? Because 2,500 years ago, there were defiant men of faith called the Hebrew prophets with names like Isaiah, names like Jeremiah. And they stood in marketplaces, not like the troubadours and minstrels of the Greeks and the Romans, who spoke about great captains of war, like Agamemnon and Achilles, who always vanquished their enemy on the battlefield. They foretold of a time of peace, when men would beat their swords into plowshares, when no child would be taught the art of war by his father. No nation would ever fight again. These were people who had a defiant vision of history. What allowed Jews who survived the Holocaust 3 years after they had been incinerated in the flames of Auschwitz to rekindle a spark of hope and start the state of Israel just in 1948? Because they were defiant people of faith. They didn't believe in fate. It was the Greeks that said, terrible is the power of fate. Because your word, your lives are scripted before you're even born. You must submit, you must accept God's plan. Ein mazal Yisrael, the Jews have no fate. We are a people of destiny. We create our own future. We are utterly unscripted. When Abraham says to God, I am childless, and I will never have a baby, because I looked at my crystal ball, I studied my charts, I'm a Sagittarius, I'm a Capricorn, I've seen what the stars have said about my future. And God took him above the stars, and he said to him, the only future you have is the one you will script by your actions. The defiant man and woman of faith. The rebellious man and woman of faith. It is so lacking from our communities and from our children. Why do you think our kids are so bored of school? Because part of the Judaism they are taught is just to listen, just to follow. And it's not to question and it's not to challenge. And yet Avraham challenged the entire world order. And Yaakov's name was changed from Jacob to Yisrael. He who wrestles with angels and is victorious. My kids come home from school and they say to me that this Rebbe taught them that the Holocaust happened because of German Jewish assimilation. I was taught the same thing in my time. So I sat my kids down and I said to them, let's just explore this for a moment. Hitler comes to power on the 29th of January 1933. There's a torchlit parade outside the Bundestag as he becomes chancellor. Within a few months, he enacts the Nuremberg laws. So the Jews in Germany know this is a really bad guy. They start to emigrate. By 1938, we already have Kristallnacht, and the Jews know that they're going to be slaughtered if they stay. How many German Jews got out of Germany prior to the Wannsee Conference of January 1942 when the Holocaust was planned in earnest, once it was a world war and Hitler could do it? In subterfuge. There were no journalists to cover it anymore. All the foreign diplomats had been expelled. What percentage of these German Jews who were so sinful actually got out? Does anyone know? 80% of German Jews survived the Holocaust. 80%. The ones who were assimilating, the ones who weren't keeping Shabbos, the ones who brought this terrible tragedy upon us all. Do you know who was killed in the Holocaust? You see, Hitler does a secret pact with Stalin to divide the country of Poland. He invades Poland on the 1st of September 1939. He immediately captures Warsaw with its 2 million Jews, 80% of whom are Hasidim with payas. Within 3 weeks, bombs the city to oblivion, and the Polish army is vanquished shortly thereafter. How many Polish Jews has he killed? Nearly 2.5 million. They're all Shabbos observant. They wouldn't dream of marrying up. This is the stupidest theory we've ever heard. It's just dumb. And what about the 1.5 million children who were killed? I was taken by Professor Jonathan Weber, the world's leading expert on the Auschwitz death camp. He wrote the book Traces of Memory, which is incredible. He went to Krakow and Galicia and found all the places where the Jews once had shuls and businesses, and he just took pictures of the little traces of Jewishness that still remain. The places where mezuzah was, the iconic rounded windows that used to be shuls that are now like car garages. And for 3 days he showed me all these places. At the end of 3 days, near the city of Tarnow, he walks me out into this clearing in the woods. And I walk, and I'm wearing sandals because it's so hot, and my feet are being cut up by thorns and thistles. I said, Jonathan, it's been like a half an hour, I don't want to walk anymore. He said, but I have to show you something unique. We walked further. I said, Jonathan, what do you? I said, I can't tell you, you have to see for yourself. We finally come to a clearing, and all there is a tree. And I said to him, what's so special about this tree? So he says to me, you see, there was a Jewish orphanage in Tarnow that had 800 Jewish children. And the Nazis in the middle of the night woke them all up, brought them to this clearing to shoot them. They dug a ditch. But the kids were small and they wouldn't follow orders. They told them to stand still so they could shoot them. But the kids kept on running around thinking it was a game. So the SS commandant finally gave the order to take the kids by their feet and swing them around and crack their skulls against this tree. And 800 Jewish kids died against this tree. That's what I wanted to show you. Did those kids marry out? Did those kids trample on God's law? That any rabbi should say, submit before God's judgment? I remember when I was a student studying in Jerusalem, and whoever is as old as me, I just turned 45, might remember as well. I was in yeshiva in Jerusalem, and a school bus in the north of Israel was crossing train tracks. And a train hit the school bus, and 27 kids were killed. And Yitzchak Peretz, who was the Israeli Minister of the Interior in the Shas party, spoke in the Knesset that week, and he said, because on the kibbutzim, because of the kibbutzim, they eat rabbit and basar lavan, pork. That's why this happened. And I remember that Shabbos. I wasn't there, but I later heard the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who was in his 80s, spoke to his Chassidim for 4 hours, as he did every Shabbos, with no notes. And in the middle of this public oration that was called the Farbrengen, he began to pound on the table, and he began to shout, and he started to say, a rabbi said that Jews die because of their sin. Hat Emetzer gechalisht? Did anyone faint when you heard that? When you heard something so outrageous that children deserve to die? Hat Emetzer gechalisht? Was there a protest? Was there an objection? Or did you all sit in your shul pews listening to this drivel, which passes in the name of Judaism, pure, unadulterated garbage, which has never even been the Jewish tradition? It's been to wrestle with God and to hold Him accountable. God said of V'charta b'chaim that one must choose life. So He has to choose life. On one of the episodes of Shalom in the Home, I go down to Florida, and there's a woman who was a non-Jewish woman living in Orlando, and her husband takes her out on Valentine's Day. And they're driving home from this expensive restaurant, and he's in a Corvette. He loves these sports cars, and they get into a terrible accident. And he's bleeding, waiting for the ambulance, and he passes away in her lap. And 6 years later, she still has this dress under her bed, and there's these black and white somber photos everywhere of her husband. And she can't get past her grief, and she just shows the kids these morbid videos of their father. And my job in 5 days is to somehow get her past this terrible tragedy so she can live again. I sit with her and I say to her, Carolyn, you know, on the last day of his life, Moses is instructing the Jewish people, and he says, and I place before you today life and death, and you must choose life. And I said to her, sometimes death chooses us. He comes in as an intruder. He invades. And our job, after he claims his victim, is to push him out and make sure he never lives among us. But when this intruder snatched from you your lover and soulmate, husband and father of your daughters, you invited him to stay and you made him into an honored guest. The ancient rabbis, I told her, said that we mourn for 7 days in order to get the mourning out of our system and to begin to choose life anew. And the reason we mourn in the Shiva is to have living people come and get us out of our morbidity so that we don't sink into this funk of living among death. There isn't a single shul in the world that has a cemetery built next to it the way the churches of Europe all are. There isn't a single city, Jewish city, where the cemetery isn't built outside city walls. We don't eat milk and meat because meat represents death and milk is the elixir of life. We don't make love during menstruation because menstruation is the lost opportunity for life. And love-making is a life-breathing exercise, not because of procreation, but because it brings the marriage to life through erotic desire and romantic lust. And we separate life and death at all times because we're a defiant people. All of these justifications that are given in Judaism for why people suffer have allowed death to live among us. There's a famous story of the Baal Shem Tov that's supposed to demonstrate why bad things happen to good people. There was a woman who came every year to the Baal Shem Tov for a blessing. The barren women would come on Shmini Atzeres, and they would get a bracha to have a child. And the Baal Shem Tov gave a blessing to 10 women in a line, but he ignored this woman. The next year she comes, and she throws herself at the Baal Shem Tov's feet, and she refuses to let go. And she says to him, I've come every year and you always ignore me. But I won't let you leave this year until you bless me with a child. So Baal Shem Tov turns to her and he says to her, next year you will be nursing a baby boy. True to his promise, the next year she had a child, and she was the happiest mother in the world. 2 years later, the child contracts pneumonia and quickly dies. The woman comes grief-stricken to the Baal Shem Tov, and she says to him, you knew, didn't you? You knew that this child would not live. That's why you wouldn't give me a blessing. Baal Shem Tov said, yes, that's correct. And she said, it would have been better not to have given me the blessing because I can't live anymore. So, Baal Shem Tov said, just this once, I will lift the curtain that separates the hidden from the revealed, so that you'll know the story of this child's soul. Baal Shem Tov says, Esther, do you remember that about 50 or 60 years ago, Chmielnitsky, during the Chmielnitsky pogroms, where 250,000 Jews were killed, he just rummaged through the countryside, rampaging, murdering, and they came to a city, a little population, and there was a little boy with no children, with no parents. So a Cossack takes the child and adopts him. After 2 years of living with this Cossack, the Russian Tsar musters his forces, defeats Chmielnitsky. They see there's a baby that's circumcised, so they give him to a Jewish family to be adopted. The child goes on to live a life, a righteous life. After 120 years, the child's soul comes before the man now, the heavenly tribunal. They say, what should we do with this person? He lived a righteous life, but the first 2 years were so turbulent. We must send the child back down to the earth to live a holy life. Baal Shem Tov said, this was your child, and this was its purpose. And this story is used constantly to demonstrate that we don't understand the ways of God. My friends, as I conclude, do you understand why the story tells us nothing? We don't understand the ways of God. This is God we're talking about. He couldn't have cleansed the soul of a 2-year-old in some manner that didn't have a woman sitting Shiva and a father saying Kaddish. God is all-powerful. The defiant, rebellious man or woman of faith decides to build because God said to build life. It will forever be a source of consternation that the people who built the state of Israel were not religious Jews. They decided it was time for historical defiance. And that's why I want to end by telling you, the past few weeks as we read the story of Yaakov, what seems to be portrayed as a very unethical man. I was at a bar mitzvah in the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue 2 weeks ago, where the bar mitzvah boy got this leather-clad chumash, and the rabbi says to him, Parshas told us, Yaakov steals the firstborn blessing. Your lesson is not to be like Yaakov. Yaakov learned from his mistakes of deceiving his father. You must do the same. It's quite a message. Happy bar mitzvah, don't be like your patriarch Jacob. The Christians claim Abraham as their own. St. Paul says that all Christians are grafted onto the seed of Abraham. The Muslims claim Abraham as their own. They even say that the Akedah took place with Yishmael, not with Yitzchak. You know who they don't claim? Who they have no interest in? Yaakov. They all say that Yaakov is a trickster. He tricks Yitzchak, he tricks Lavan. And Shakespeare used Yaakov as the archetype for Shylock. The Jew who cares so much about money that he will deceive in order to get it. This has become the archetype of the unfaithful Jew, the Jew who uses all his wiles, all his manipulation to make a profit. Why are we the children of Yaakov and not the children of Abraham? Let me finish with this. Because Yaakov was the first Jew who said, I will fight bad guys even if it makes me look bad, but I won't let them take over the world. I will fight Esav even if the history books say that I had to use some of his same methods to defeat him. And I will not let Lavan get great wealth because he'll abuse it. And these are bad people. Today, so many people tell the state of Israel, don't invade Lebanon with Hezbollah. Don't invade Gaza. There's going to be international condemnation. CNN will be there, and MSNBC will be there, and you're going to look like aggressors. But Israel has decided, even if its reputation will suffer, that it's not going to let terrorists take over the Middle East. Abraham Lincoln was the most hated man in the North and the South. Everyone said, let the South go. So they'll practice slavery. But you're being seen as a butcher. 580,000 Americans died in the Civil War. In his time, he was called a killer. But history vindicated him as our greatest president. It was Neville Chamberlain who was seen as the man of peace. He waved a piece of paper and said, peace in our time. Churchill was the warmonger. The British had just fought the Germans in World War I. They didn't want another war. But Churchill said, even if we're accused of being belligerent, we have to stop Hitler from rearming. No one listened to him. And the price paid was the Holocaust. The defiant man or woman of faith is he or she who's prepared to engage the world and be unpopular for it. That's why I so revere the state of Israel. There is no country besides North Korea more hated in the world than Israel is today. Because, well, Europe will turn a blind eye to all the bad things that happen. Israel will not. And now the United States will not. Today we have the specter of Iran taking pictures, putting our drone on international TV, saying the United States violated its airspace. Like Yaakov, look at the way these Americans behave. And they took the American flag and replaced the stars with skulls. The United States represents a totalitarian expansionist nation that just wants to dominate others. But this country will fight to make sure that Ahmadinejad doesn't take over the world. We must do the same thing. The reason why I believe in organizations like this is it raises a generation, primarily of women who are defiant. There are two ways you can live your life. You could be complacent and fit into a box and be subservient. You could spend your time making sure you look great, that you exercise daily, that your kids go to every single after-school activity, that they play the violin and they play concertos on a piano, that they're chess champions and golf champions, and school vacation is coming up in January. You can spend the whole next 6 weeks preparing to make sure you go on the greatest ski vacation, and you'll fit perfectly into that box, and you will have lived the American dream. But just know that the color and vitality in you will have been snuffed out. But if you get involved in an organization like this, to give a flippin' damn about people who are suffering and not say, God will take care of them. Because the history of our relationship with God is that God still has a lot of explaining to do as to why He hasn't taken care of us, and we must act in God's stead. That's an Orthodox Jew, the rebellious man of faith. You have to give a damn. You have to feed the hungry and clothe the naked and comfort the bereaved and counsel couples who are in crisis. You got to be defiant. You cannot accept the world for what it is, and you must teach your children to be defiant. Don't let them be submissive Orthodox Jews who think that being frum means giving a little bit of tzedakah, going to university campus and popping up in Hillel once a week. Tell them to build something. Tell them to be different. On the campuses today, Israel could not be more hated. You are going to be pulverized. You're going to lose friends. You're going to be sitting having a beer and someone's going to say some remark. And you're going to have a choice at that moment to be quiet and submissive or to open your mouth. Raise kids who open their mouths. That's the only way our nation will live. And finally, when you see people who are really suffering, don't ever believe. And don't ever believe they've done anything to deserve it, and don't ever excuse their suffering that God has a plan. There is no plan for human suffering. The idea of Mashiach is a defiant Jewish posture, Bila Hamovas Lanetza, for death to be defeated, for war to be defeated, for famine to be defeated. We don't believe in suffering. Christians believe in suffering. They have a suffering servant who dies on a cross and brings redemption to mankind. We have no such belief. Suffering brings absolutely nothing. It doesn't make you wiser. It doesn't ennoble you. It doesn't make you deeper. It doesn't make you more sensitive. That's all garbage. On the contrary, suffering makes you twisted. It bends your heart out of shape. It makes you less sensitive. It makes you excuse other people's suffering. And any good that comes from your suffering comes despite the fact you suffered and not because of it. That's why, as I truly conclude, L'chaim is just water. Elie Wiesel tells a beautiful story. That as, at the end of the Holocaust, 9 rabbis went to Europe, and they decided to take God to trial. And there was a prosecuting attorney, and there was a defense attorney. The charge, the abandonment of the Jews of Europe to Hitler. And they deliberated for weeks. Nimnu v'gamru, in the final analysis, they all agreed that God was, 9 Orthodox rabbis, guilty as charged. God had abandoned the Jews of Europe. And you know what they did after the verdict was issued? They went out into the street, they found a 10th Jew, and they davened mincha. Because the same God who had commanded them to pray 3 times a day commanded them to build organizations like these. Not to rely just on divine assistance, but to rely on divine instruction. I really salute all the women who could easily be focused on selfish concerns and selfish pursuits, who could be going to something that is very self-serving, and instead give a damn about Amunah, ensuring that in the state of Israel, children with nothing are given something, that they are treated as equal children of God, that they are shown love, caring, and even in these harsh economic times, please open your hearts and open your pocketbooks and make sure that you use the resources that God gave you as a blessing.
Amen.